There is a grain that once fed entire empires without ever being replanted. It survived droughts that wiped out wheat and winters that killed barley. Once it took root, it returned year after year, feeding families for generations. For thousands of years, it was the backbone of survival across 2 continents. Then it vanished, not because it failed, not because something better replaced it. It disappeared because it worked too well. A crop that feeds people without dependence cannot be controlled. Today, as modern agriculture strains under drought, rising costs, and fragile supply chains, this forgotten grain matters again. This is the grain they tried to erase. Before wheat dominated fields and rice flooded paddies, there was another grain. It grew on hillsides too steep for plows. It survived frosts that killed other cereals. It returned each spring without anyone scattering seed. This plant did not behave like other crops. Most grains are annuals. They grow, produce seed, and die within a single season. Farmers must save or purchase seed and start again every year. But this grain operated on different rules. Its roots lived underground through winter, through drought, through neglect. When conditions improved, it simply resumed growing. One planting fed a family for years. No seed merchants, no seasonal gambles, no debt. For early societies, this was not just convenient. It was revolutionary. A grain that perpetuated itself meant freedom from the anxiety of failed harvests. It meant food security without dependence on trade, on weather, on anyone's permission. So what was this miracle grain? And why has almost no one alive today ever heard of it? This is perennial millet, not the annual variety you find in birdseed bags today, but its ancient ancestor, a grain with roots that refuse to die. Most crops demand replanting every season. Perennial millet broke that contract. Its root system survived winter, drought, and neglect. When spring arrived, it emerged again without human hands ever touching the soil. One planting could yield harvests for 5 to 10 years. The plant spread across the steppes of Central Asia, through northern China, and into the highlands of Europe. Archaeological sites dating back 8,000 years reveal its seeds in storage vessels and cooking pits. It was not a secondary grain. It was primary, foundational. The yields were remarkable. Some varieties produced up to 1,000 pounds per acre on marginal land that would starve wheat. It grew where rivers did not reach. It thrived where frost came early. And it asked for almost nothing in return. And the people who relied on it built entire worlds around its return. But the role it played in early civilizations went far beyond food. In ancient China, millet was the first cultivated grain, predating rice by millennia. The earliest dynasties measured wealth not in gold, but in millet stores. Farmers in the Yellow River Valley built their entire calendar around its cycles. Spring shoots, summer growth, autumn harvest, winter rest. The grain returned, and so did they. Nomadic tribes across the Eurasian steppe carried it as insurance. Unlike fragile wheat, millet tolerated their migrations. They scattered seed in one valley, moved on, and returned months later to a waiting harvest. It demanded no permanent settlement, no irrigation, no overlords. In rural Europe, peasant communities planted perennial millet along field margins and forest edges. These patches were not ornamental. They were emergency reserves. When rye failed or barley rotted, the millet stood. Families who maintained these hidden plots survived famines that killed their neighbors. The grain wove itself into daily life so deeply that people stopped noticing it. Porridge at dawn, flatbread at dusk, beer brewed from surplus. It was ordinary, invisible, essential. And that invisibility is precisely what made it a target. Perennial millet created something rulers could not tolerate: independence. If you want more forgotten histories like this one, consider subscribing to keep these stories alive. A family with millet roots in the ground owed nothing to seed merchants. They paid no annual fee to plant. They borrowed no grain from landlords in desperate seasons. They waited for no one's permission to eat. This self-sufficiency rippled outward. Villages that grew perennial grains resisted centralized control. They traded less because they needed less. They migrated less because they had no reason to seek wages. They survived sieges because their food source was invisible underground, impossible to burn or confiscate. Armies recognized its power. Roman legions carried millet because it stored longer than wheat and cooked faster than barley. Mongol riders packed it across continents. It required no ovens, no grinding stones, no elaborate preparation. Boil it in water and ride on. Traders valued it for the same reasons. Lightweight, durable, calorie-dense. A sack of millet could cross deserts without spoiling, but every quality that made it valuable to the individual made it threatening to the institution. A grain that granted freedom was a grain that weakened control, and once control became the goal, the outcome was inevitable. The problem with perennial millet was simple. You could not build an empire on a crop that asked for nothing. Wheat required land management, irrigation systems, and seasonal labor. Rice demanded flooded paddies, coordinated planting, and centralized water control. Both crops created dependency. Farmers needed infrastructure. Infrastructure required administration. Administration required taxes. Taxes required compliance. Perennial millet broke that chain. It grew on hillsides no one owned. It returned without purchased seed. It escaped the mechanisms of debt and obligation that bound peasants to landowners and landowners to kings. Tax collectors found it nearly impossible to track. How do you tie the crop that grows in scattered patches, harvested quietly, stored in household jars? How do you regulate a grain that needs no mill, no market, no middleman? As centralized states expanded, they favored crops they could measure and control. Wheat became the grain of tribute. Rice became the grain of empire. Millet was labeled primitive, a relic of backwardness, food for the poor and the forgotten. The erasure was never announced. It was simply engineered through preference, policy, and pressure. What followed was not an accident of history, but a coordinated decline. The campaign against perennial millet unfolded across centuries, invisible but relentless. In China, imperial policies promoted wet rice cultivation in fertile lowlands. Farmers who switched received tax incentives. Those who clung to millet faced rising levies on marginal lands. The message was clear: modernize or starve slowly. In Europe, feudal lords consolidated fields into managed estates. Scattered millet patches were plowed under to make room for uniform wheat plantings. Grain laws mandated which crops could be sold at market. Millet was rarely on the list. Trade routes shifted toward port cities optimized for wheat and rice export. Millet had no place in the emerging global economy. It could not be shipped in bulk, branded, or monopolized. Cultural campaigns followed. Millet became associated with poverty, with the uncivilized margins. Eating it marked you as backward. The upwardly mobile ate bread. They ate polished rice. They ate what empires endorsed. Within a few generations, knowledge of perennial varieties faded. Farmers forgot which cultivars returned on their own. They forgot which roots survived frost. The grain slipped out of memory and into the margins. But margins are where survivors wait. In the highlands of Ethiopia, farmers still grow ancient millet varieties passed down for generations. In remote corners of Central Asia, perennial grasses related to domesticated millet cling to existence. The genetics endured where attention did not reach. Now, scientists are paying attention again. Researchers at agricultural institutes across 3 continents are studying perennial grains as the answer to climate collapse. Crops that do not require annual tilling prevent soil erosion. Roots that persist year-round sequester carbon and retain water. Fields that replant themselves eliminate dependence on corporate seed supplies. Early trials show perennial grain systems reducing input costs by up to 50% while maintaining competitive yields. In a world facing drought, topsoil loss, and rising fertilizer prices, the math is changing. The same qualities that made perennial millet dangerous to empires now make it essential for survival. It needs no permission. It needs no purchase. It simply grows, returns, and feeds. They called it primitive. They called it a weed. They erased it from history and memory. But the roots never died. They waited beneath the surface for the world to remember what it forgot.